Awesome. A new month, a new quarter meeting. So on my end, thank you for the review, Bartek. So the one of my old HiveMind merge request has been merged. So an old bug is about to be fixed whenever we release it. I'm not quite sure what the release schedule is for HiveMind, but it's like low priority. So whenever you guys are ready. Um, on top of that, I started looking at documentation a bit because Crimson has been telling me that it's been complicated for her to onboard new devs because new devs are confused by the state of our documentation because it's been done by inertia a while ago now. So I looked into it and I wanted to touch base on that with you, Gandalf, because from what I understood, you are also looking into it. Um, and yeah, so that's kind of my points for the thing. I'm going to submit my final. I have a bunch of code locally that I haven't pushed, but I'm going to submit the communities types 2 and 3 probably this week for review. Bartek. It's mostly test at this point. Um, yeah, that's about it.
Okay, sounds good. So you mentioned release schedule, so it's very appropriate since I think we're going to have a release. We're going to do a release candidate probably this week for just about everything, I guess. So that means Hive half, and pretty much all the half apps and some of the other new apps as well, hopefully. So the release candidate will come out, like I said, this week sometime, and then we're aiming to actually do an official release around the end of the month. So in the meantime, we'll basically solicit people to start trying to try it out. We'll run it on production tests, and we'll also be doing performance benchmarking and things like that during this month. So um, as far as I guess I put out a post that's in previous posts that have really documented, I guess, everything that's going into the new release. But we'll also create an issue a list of release features too, along with that when we do the release candidate. Um, so I guess in terms of things I can think of that are probably biggest changes, one would be in half that we're storing the operations in binary format. So I've been encouraging anybody who's doing half development for a while to use the development version. So finally, we'll be to the point where they can use the master version, I think, without having to necessarily use the developed version for everything. Um, Beyond that, we've also another thing that's kind of important is that we've created new record types for all the blockchain operations in half. And there's the idea behind this is first of all, it makes it more performant. So it's sort of like a best practices way to create your half app. You wouldn't necessarily have to use them, but it's extremely highly recommended that you do. And it'll also make your app easier to combine with other half apps. So I guess it's probably been a while since I talked about this idea, so maybe just to mention it again, the whole one of the driving forces behind half really was that we were looking at the beginning at how to improve the API of Hive. So this is also, I guess, significant in terms of talking about documentation. And so the idea I kind of settled on was that we'd move most of the API development outside of Hive itself, Hive D itself, and into basically half apps. So the idea is Hive pushes all the data into a half database, and then we can create whatever kind of APIs we need with that data, and it gives us a lot of flexibility. So on the one hand, it means you can create your own custom API, but on the other hand, it also means that we've got a way that somebody can basically create an API and then provide it to other people. So as an example of that, we created this balance tracker app, which you've been improving recently, and it gives basically an entire new API for doing things like graphing balances of an account over time, for instance, something that before was you basically had to do all the work yourself. And it was a decent amount of work to do. We're also creating a similar API for the Block Explorer that we're creating. So the Block Explorer that we're developing can be divided into two parts. There's the API, which is a half-based app, and then there's just a UI that runs on top of it that actually uses that API. But that API can be used by anybody who's developing a Block Explorer or just anybody who wants to make some of the API calls that are available in that Block Explorer API app. So I hope that's clear as to why half I think is really important. It's really our next generation API. in many ways. It's just and it basically redefines the flow of how we create our API. In the past, the API was kind of a very centralized process to change it because all the changes had to be made at the Hive D level, which is sort of the most security sensitive area. Whereas now, basically anybody can create a new API that they plug in on top of on top of Hive, just using Half app to do it. And we've seen a couple people do that. Just recently, Matayari, in fact, basically created a sort of a similar tool to the Hive SQL app, which basically gives us, a new API as well. And also Mwatsi created one for notifications. So I hope that's clear as to why I think this is really important for us, this idea that anybody can now add and modify the API itself if they want to, and they can change its characteristics for performance or for ease of use, whatever they need. So anyways, I guess that's the gist of what we're doing, I guess, in terms of Half. The other things that have been done recently, we made some more bug fixes and improvements aimed at easing the life of the node operators. So we've been making changes to the block log tools, improvements to the replay and sync process. And we also got a couple new apps that will also be released as part of this this upcoming release. We have a Beekeeper, which is essentially a new way to manage keys and also to create transactions. And we're hoping this will be like a library that basically everyone can use going forward. So we'll have a very small footprint, very well audited way of people can use to, anybody who's building an app can generate transactions and sign them. So it's really two versions of Beekeeper. One's a C++ based app, and that's really for essentially just desktop applications. And then we've also got a new tool we're creating now, Beekeeper WASM, which is basically a WebAssembly version of Beekeeper, so you can run it inside a browser. And I think that'll be really interesting for anyone who's creating Java-based apps with Hive. Beyond that, we also got two other apps that we're creating right now, Clive, which is a replacement for the CLI, a wallet that's been around for ages and really hasn't been done much to in a while. So we've been just basically, it's been on maintenance. And so Clive is basically a much easier to use version of that. It's got more of a, even though it's a console app, it really has a GUI, so that makes it a lot more friendly. And the other app we're working on right now is Denser, which is a replacement for Condenser. This is essentially a totally new app that just models the look and feel of Condenser, but is using more new technologies, and we're trying to develop something that's much easier to maintain. And both of those are proceeding pretty well. I think we're going to include some version of Clive in the new release. Denser is really a little more separate, so I don't know if we'll see a release for that. Probably not. So that's kind of what we've been working on. And since Howard mentioned his improvements to the community roles feature, yeah, that's also been incorporated in HiveMine, and that'll be released as part of the general release. So essentially every Half app almost is going to get a new release as part of this process. That's pretty much it, I guess, for our plans for the next month. Anybody else? I don't know if anybody else wanted to cover what they've been working on, or if anybody has any questions. Actually, maybe better to open up for questions on any of that stuff first, because about the new release or any of the new features or tools or anything.
I had a question about the APIs, or basically, like following on from what you said. I had wanted to see feedback about potential new, like an additional layer to everything you just said about the APIs and the flexibility of sort of empowering the devs to create their own API, how they want it. And this is the sort of basic, I guess, principle of it would be more robust if there was like many small APIs, like even potentially.
Yeah, that's exactly the intent of Half. In fact, I used to call Half at the original origin. I used to call it modular HiveMind, which was and I think I might have stole the name from How, but the idea behind it was HiveMind had this really large API of all these different various, somewhat unrelated API calls, and so we wanted to have a way that you could basically create apps, we would have smaller sets of APIs that you could decide, I want to support these APIs on my half server, and then I'll run this app. So basically, by choosing what apps you run on your half server, you essentially decide what APIs you want to support on your server, and then you can either make that a public half server that other people can use the APIs on, or if you're doing your own private server for your own application, you could just pick and choose which APIs you need to support.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really great. And I guess where I'm going with this is potentially in order to reduce the server itself, like in terms of hardware needs, because right now you have to have, in order to have HAF, you have to also run HiveD, which creates its own server requirements. So if there was a way to sort of have very tiny sort of hardware requirements and provide an API, and so you could have, a large number of APIs in addition to like just an additional layer. And how that could be done potentially is if there's like a standalone database, Postgres database, that like queries full HAF node and just gets in real time only the blockchain data that it's interested in. Let's say only this type of custom JSON or something like that, right?
Yeah,
So,
I think that's totally feasible. I mean, that can easily be done today. Sure.
Yeah. Right. So I guess I wanted to see if this makes sense, and if this would fit well with what's planned for HAF, because I know there's.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, like I said, what you're talking about really is even possible now, because when somebody's running an API node operator is running a server, if he's running, I mean, there's still some legacy stuff, but if he's running the latest stuff, then he's already running a HAF database that's already got a huge amount of data, and he's running a it's got all the data for HAF for basically all the account history API, for instance. So you could then create another. You could basically make calls to his node and then just save off the data that you want to save off to your to your local database. That's completely feasible. I guess the issues I would see right now with doing that is if you did it without HAF technology backing your own local database, and maybe this is something I want to think about, because the thing about having it backed by using HAF as the database rather than just using a generic database is that in the case of forking, if you're running a HAF-based database, it'll automatically fork back to, everything will revert to the right version. You won't run into a consistency problem. Whereas if you're just querying a HAF server to get the data from it, then when a fork happens, the data changes on a HAF server, but your database wouldn't necessarily know that data, the past data you'd fetched, had changed due to the fork. So that could be one particular issue with the implementation you're describing versus just running a full HAF app.
Yeah.
So I'll have to think about that, see if there's something we could do to mitigate that. Of course, and if you're working in irreversible mode, that's not an issue. So if your app is only getting data after it's irreversible, then that's not a problem at all. And that's probably just fine. I think now, when we developed HAF originally, handling reversible data was much more important because it took a while for data to become irreversible. But once we introduced the one block irreversibility feature, generally speaking, your most data becomes irreversible, very, very quickly, within a second or so, or less. So maybe it's not such a problem nowadays for that problem.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Because of the one block irreversibility, it's basically the API can provide the blockchain data in real time, even though it's just it queries just the irreversible.
Yeah,
data.
yeah. But still, look, I don't think anybody, in general usage, they wouldn't even notice the difference. The only time that might come up would be in case of a large fork that forked, a number of blocks. But that's extremely rare nowadays. Generally, you must see one block, that gets reverted.
Yeah, and it would, I guess it's a must that it has to, well, not strictly speaking, but in order to keep it interoperable, it would have to use Postgres, everything the same as the.
I think that would be best. I mean, it to me, it makes sense if we use the same tools.
Yeah.
It makes it easier for devs to move back and forth between projects.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things, that's one of the thrusts we've actually had with Half, is we're moving more and more towards trying to make sure that if you develop your Half app, you've got a best practices way to do it that makes it easier if you go look at somebody else's Half app and understand it, and also that you're doing it the best way, essentially, doing it in a way that's most performant.
Well, ideally, it would be you could even take the code and directly make it into a Half app, like everything would be
absolutely
working. Yeah.
And so one of the things, I think the most important things we did recently in terms of Half, other than the binary, was this idea of creating these record types that basically they're just SQL record types that define the blockchain operations in a standardized way. So if you do that, if you use those for your database, then it'll be easier to to make it into a Half app and to exchange data with a Half app too, another Half app.
Great. So I'll be looking out for that to be. That's not yet.
It's all in the develop. Yeah, it's all in the develop branch. So once we get the release candidate out, but like I said, I've been telling people for a while that if you're developing Half, just work in the develop branch right now. There's so many improvements there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, I guess that's. Any other questions about any of this stuff? I mean, I had some people privately ask me about Denser and things like that, but I don't know if anybody has any questions about it or if it's clear why we're doing it. So I guess it's clear enough. So I guess that's about it for me, unless there's other questions.
All right. Anyone else has anything to think on?
Could be a short meeting today.
Yeah, sounds like. Yeah. Well, I don't have anything else on the agenda for myself, so if you guys don't have anything, we can call it.
I guess nothing from my side either, but we're excited to see the release candidate and then hopefully the release by end of month. So keep up the great work, guys.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Okay. See you guys.
All right. See you around. Goodbye.